20 years ago, I began studying law both in college and in private study groups. I wrote a 200-page book on the Constitution for a college class, and I've been involved in over a dozen court cases involving constitutional issues. In the private study groups, I noticed that almost everyone attending them were Republicans. I decided long ago that I wasn't going to register to vote, so therefore I'm non-partisan. But over the past 4 years, I have found myself leaning right because of all the leftist prejudice, hatred, cancel culture, and especially the ignorance about how the laws of their own country work, the extreme importance of the Constitution, and how it protects them as well as everyone. I discovered this Pakman guy only recently. I couldn't let yet another propaganda-laced video from him sit there without responding to it.
Republican Senator Josh Hawley got a lot of attention before January 6th, and he got an attaboy from Donald Trump because Josh Hawley was the first Republican senator to say he would be objecting to the electoral vote count on January 6th.
Just as the Democrats tried to do back in 2017 when Trump was elected, however, not following the proper lawful procedure, whereas this time around, the Republicans did follow the proper lawful procedure and were focused on legitimate constitutional concerns, as I will cover shortly.
Cut to January 6th, and we have a violent insurrection led by Trumpists and
a violent insurrection led by Trumpists. So, how would you define what happened throughout all of 2020? A violent revolt against an oppressive authority, usually a government. What was it that BLM and Antifa were doing all of last summer that included the murder of a child and the destruction of mom and pop businesses, fires? Suddenly, when the right performs a civic duty to protesting against their government, only when the right does it, it's a, quote, insurrection. But when leftists, BLM and Antifa protesting against their government, it is not an insurrection. It's merely a protest, despite a child dying, fires, and the massive destruction of businesses. And how quickly we forget the federal courthouse in Portland. Government building, the same as Capitol Hill. Look up the fires that were set there and for how long that government building was hijacked. And with the endless hypocrisy that I've come to not only expect but can easily predict from the left, was not an insurrection. It was merely a peaceful protest.
And they reconvened. Josh Hawley kept going with his objections and his bogus arguments about the election.
Bogus arguments about the election. You're just going to leave it there for your ignorant leftist audience. So David considers serious constitutional infractions to be, quote, bogus. The objections raised relate to Act 77, signed by the governor. Understand that no governor has the authority to override the Constitution in any state. The PASC decision was to simply say, quote, you're too late, which allegedly and magically renders an unlawful act lawful, when, folks, it most certainly does not. Hence the existence of constitutional arguments that the USSC hears to begin with. In other words, it was a matter of you didn't complain on time. Therefore, even though the law is being broken and the election is unlawful, it's all just fine. Folks, find me a constitutional scholar who agrees with a biased and prejudiced court decision.
So as a result of that, Josh Hawley lost a business opportunity. Book publisher Simon & Schuster decided they don't want to have anything to do with Josh Hawley anymore. And they said, we are backing out of the book deal that we had made with Josh Hawley. Now remember, Simon & Schuster is a company that exists in the United States, meaning they get to decide who they work with. They get to decide what book they publish. It's not the government. If the government got to decide what books Simon & Schuster published, we would be more like a country with centralized control of industry. Some might call them communist.
And bravo, you understand how it works. Isn't it ironic, David, how you suggest that this would be communist as we watch social media and cancel culture deplatform everyone who doesn't agree with their viewpoint? You know what I think is going on here? You are so used to engaging with an audience that is ignorant about how the laws in their own country work that you just assume they won't understand this. And I'll admit, I think you would be correct in that assumption.
Let's continue.
Well, they don't like the exercise of free speech, Tucker, I think, is at the end of the day. I mean, this is really about the First Amendment. It's really about free speech. And unfortunately, a lot of people on the left now have decided that the First Amendment is something they no longer support. And I'll just say this, Tucker, at a time of division, we've got to rally around the things that unites us as Americans. And I think the First Amendment and free speech has got to be at the top of that list.
So this is not about the First Amendment. Why do they keep talking about the First Amendment? Josh Hawley has a right as a lawmaker. It's not really even about speech. As a senator, Josh Hawley can object to votes on the grounds he objected to them. Simon & Schuster, as a corporation that exists in the United States, can decide we want to publish a book with Josh Hawley or we don't. That's it. That's the full story here. Josh Hawley is wrong that this is about the First Amendment or about free speech.
David. No one is discussing constitutional doctrine here. They're discussing constitutional ideology. Book companies have the ability to support those ideologies through their actions or not support them through their actions. Both of these gentlemen understand this concept fully, and I believe they even reference it shortly.
Freedom of speech doesn't mean freedom from the consequences of that speech. Speech has consequences. It's called capitalism, which they support.
So I'm going to give you an out here and assume you don't mean speech has only the consequence of capitalism. And yes, of course they support capitalism. As a side note, if you're suggesting there is something wrong with capitalism as it stands, the left, with their socialist ideals, sure do benefit a heck of a lot off of capitalism.
Tucker then also appears not to get it.
But a publisher is literally the guardian of the First Amendment. If you're a publisher, you exist because of the First Amendment. Your duty is to protect the First Amendment. But the people around Simon & Schuster are now so crazed with ideology that they can't bear to hear a contrary view expressed. I mean, what does that portend for the country?
Well, I think it really shows, Tucker, that we're in a period where the First Amendment values and principles of freedom of speech, also freedom of worship, freedom of religion, these things are really under attack by some quarters, by many quarters.
That is not at all what this is about. This has nothing to do with Simon & Schuster wanting to suppress speech or not being willing to hear a different opinion.
So are you a representative of Simon & Schuster, David? Do you have their power of attorney, or were you given the authority to speak on their behalf? Because the evidence, their actions, can easily prove beyond a preponderance that suppressing speech and opinion is exactly what they're trying to do.
Simon & Schuster made a business decision. Josh Hawley is a disgusting, depraved, extremist, agitator. His actions on January 6th confirm it.
Josh is a disgusting, depraved, extremist agitator for challenging the unlawful actions of a governor?
Simon & Schuster decided, the books we would sell by doing this book with Josh Hawley, for us, don't outweigh the downside to our business of working with him. And they made a decision. How can anyone argue against Simon & Schuster's unilateral right to make that decision?
No one is arguing it, David. Now it's your turn to admit how legally, through corporate acts, stopping speech and cancel culture mirrors communist culture's suppression of the people.
But Simon & Schuster simply said, we don't want to do business with someone. And Hawley goes to the First Amendment here. Take a look.
And again, I come back to the fact that this is something, the First Amendment is something that unites us as Americans. And in this time of division, in this time of chaos, we've got to stand strong for that.
If you're wondering why, when reporters go to Trump rallies and they interview people, the people start talking about this is a First Amendment violation and that's a First Amendment violation and this violated my free speech or Trump's free speech. This is why. They are bombarded constantly with people who either don't understand or are deliberately lying to them about what is a free speech issue. What is a First Amendment issue when it has nothing to do with that whatsoever?
Why are you referencing only Trump rallies? Could it be because you're biased? Based on your own ignorance of constitutional law and doctrine, and as a speaker with a platform for the left, isn't it safe for the rest of us to assume that lefties are at least as ignorant as any righties about where free speech boundaries are? After all, you're not even discussing the constitutional infractions. You're simply making an unqualified claim of, quote, they're all extremists with bogus arguments. Again, not backing it up with anything. So, does your audience just believe you? And if so, doesn't that make them, quote, bombarded constantly by you, a person who doesn't understand or is deliberately lying to them?
So, every time I ask this, a bunch of people say, Tucker definitely knows this is not really about speech. Josh Hawley probably also knows they're being disingenuous. That may be. It doesn't matter why they're doing it. It's bamboozling a lot of people.
So you wait until the end of your video with a certain percentage of viewers have dropped off based on statistics to admit that, of course, both of the gentlemen understand the difference, while at the same time having the gall to reference bamboozling an audience, something you seem to be really well versed in. Tucker's audience is not filled with a reality show intellect. His show is one of the most successful because he constantly speaks in common sense logic and intelligence, something you're proving to your audience you don't have. Anyone who calls performing a civic duty challenging an unconstitutional act a quote, depraved extremist is one of two things or both. You're ignorant about the constitutional process of your own country or against that process and seek to promote anti-American ideals. So which is it, David? Debate me in the comments section, or preferably find an attorney with a background in constitutional law to debate against me. In either case, you will lose. I've been at this for 20 years, not 2 months since the election. There's absolutely no question the election was entirely tainted using the excuse of a virus to unlawfully change rules, and that alone is enough to prove the election was null and void in at least several states and up to 30 states changed rules using the excuse of the virus. And I'm not even touching on the ballot issue nor the voting software issues. This affects us all. Doesn't anyone know why Sidney Powell separated herself from Rudy Giuliani's team? It's because what she was discovering, in conjunction with plenty of security professionals and others, that it's not just that Biden benefited from a banana republic election. It was that Republicans did too. 75 plus million Americans were denied due process rights in courts, refusing to hear evidence about the election. That 75 million number is actually much higher. It amounts to all 325 million of us, or however the population of the U.S. is. Refusing to hear evidence does not mean evidence sufficient to prove something doesn't exist. It means the court/judge does not want to get involved and is using their discretion and judicial immunity to avoid getting involved. I've made videos on this subject for years. Again, I've been at this 20 years, not 2 months. The denial of due process on such a large scale finally brought forth to America what those of us who've studied law for a long time already knew. If we don't have constitutional rights here, such as due process, what do we have? And the massive ignorance of the left, not understanding the laws of their own country that were put in place to protect them to begin with, is what got us here. Your vote will never count again because of your side's ignorance of the law and refusal to even consider what is so blatantly obvious to everyone else. We are officially in the United States of Bananica as of January 2021. Watch this year as all the evidence that could ever be needed to prove not only a preponderance, but beyond a reasonable doubt that the basic right of an honest and lawful election in America no longer exists.